Hi, my name is Morgan and I'm a neuroscience PhD student. So next week I'm going to be giving a talk to a classroom of high school seniors, and while I was putting it together I realized it's been a while since I talked about my own research and also the journey of becoming a PhD student or a neuroscientist. So I figured I would practice the talk by giving it to you guys. I will be posting the same video to my YouTube channel and my TikTok, and if you're watching this on YouTube, I am recording all of this just on my phone without any of my normal recording equipment, so if the sound quality isn't quite what you're used to, that's why. But let's get into it and talk about what a neuroscientist does and how you become one. So just to give you like an idea of what to expect, I'm going to talk a little bit about myself and just like some fun facts about me, and then what I do and what other neuroscientists do, and then the journey to becoming a neuroscientist. So first of all, a little bit about me. I am a first generation student, and what that means is that I'm the first person in my family to attend college. I also grew up in a small town in Oklahoma, so I come from a very rural background. Right now I'm doing my PhD in Texas. I did my undergrad in Oklahoma. I have 4 cats, and that's probably the most important part of this talk. And something that's important to note, because a lot of people think that neuroscientists and scientists in general are just sort of robots. We just exist in the lab all day and all we do is study. We do have hobbies, so some of mine include painting and knitting. And I did work my way throughout undergrad. Originally, I wanted to become a medical doctor, and from all of the researchers that I've talked to, that's a pretty common experience, because one of the first scientists that we're ever introduced to usually is a medical doctor, and so a lot of us see that as the main option for people who want to become some sort of scientist, and also they're the main scientists that we see helping people. So why did I change my mind and decide to become a neuroscientist? The first thing is that I came to the realization that while medical doctors are the main people that you see helping people, there are teams of researchers behind them who have developed the drugs that they're using, who have developed the methods that they're using, and lots of other things. So being a researcher does still help people, it's just not as direct. The brain is the only organ that's able to study itself, which I think is really fascinating, especially because myself and other neuroscientists study learning. So learning about learning is pretty neat, and it can get pretty meta. There are endless discoveries to be made about the brain. We do know how some stuff works, but for the most part, the brain is a mystery. And so really good job security there in that we don't fully understand how the brain works yet. And the brain creates everything that you see. So in the back of the brain, back here, there's a thing called the visual cortex. And in the visual cortex, your brain puts together everything that you are seeing with your eyes, some stuff that's happening in your ears, where you are like in space and time, to put together the image of the world that you are seeing. So really your brain creates your whole reality. And your brain controls the rest of your body. So a lot of people think that neuroscience is only looking at brains, but really any part of your body that connects to the brain, which is all of it, you are able to study through neuroscience. So I've talked about why neuroscience is really neat, but like what does a neuroscientist or a researcher actually do? So first of all, on this slide, I have 2 photos of different brains. So that top photo is of a rat brain and the bottom photo is of a human brain. So something that's really neat is that neuroscientists study all sorts of brains. It's not just human brains. I've known people who work with primates, who work with dolphins, mice, rats, flies, really anything. If it has a brain, neuroscientists study its brain. So this is sort of what a typical day looks like for a PhD student. Number one, PhD students do take classes. Typically, you only take classes for the first 2 years, but that does depend on your program. And what's really neat about classes whenever you get to a PhD level is that they're all like relative to what you're studying. So, you know, like a lot of times wherever you're studying like math or history or really anything that's not biological sciences, if you tend more towards the biological sciences, you might be like, when am I ever going to use this in real life? But your PhD classes, you likely will be using in real life. We also do experiments, and that can look different for different people depending on what they're studying. So it could involve like growing cells in a petri dish. It could be working with your mice or your rats, training them to do different things. There's a lot of different types of experiments. They also do a lot of data analysis and a lot of staining, at least in my lab. So if you're unfamiliar with staining, what that is if you look at this photo of the brain that I showed earlier, this is again a rat brain, you can't really like make out specific structures in the brain whenever it's just the brain. But if you add a dye and different stains look at different things, but if you add this dye, then you can see more parts of the brain more distinctly. And I really enjoy this particular brain section because I think it looks like a grumpy face, so that's fun. We also spend a lot of time just hanging out with our animals. So whenever you do animal research, one thing that is extremely important is to make sure that you are not stressing the animal and that it's very familiar with you, because that could throw off your data, and also it's just the right thing to do. So we do spend time just sort of hanging out with them, letting them get to know us and stuff like that. We also spend a lot of time planning our experiments, what day we're going to do them on, how long they're going to take, if we can run multiple experiments at once, and ordering things for the lab. And writing. There is a lot of writing involved in doing a PhD. There's writing different grants to get us money, writing your research papers, writing press releases, applications for fellowships and scholarships, just a ton of writing. So now I'll talk a little bit about my previous research, just to give you a more specific example of the type of stuff that we do. So the very first lab that I was in, we were studying traumatic brain injuries, which you might have heard of in relationship to like football players or the military, but everyone is at risk for a traumatic brain injury. You could slip and fall and get one. In my next lab, I was studying a hormone called oxytocin, and this is commonly called the love hormone, although I do take issue with that name. It's sort of like the easiest way to remember what it does, or one of the things that it does. So I was studying how it may regulate monogamy in different mouse species. And then I was also in a lab that studied microbleeds. So this is a picture of a mouse brain with a bleed in it. That little brown part is a bleed. And microbleeds are kind of a precursor to a stroke. So we were looking at how to maybe prevent strokes if you can identify the microbleeds first. And now I'm studying something called Pavlovian conditioning. So if you've heard like the classic story of Pavlov, what supposedly happened is that every time he would feed his dogs, he would like ring a little bell, and he noticed that the dogs would start salivating just at the sound of the bell. He didn't even need to give them the food to make their mouths water. And because of this, he developed what we now call Pavlovian conditioning or classical conditioning. So basically you take something that is an unconditioned stimulus, like the food. So a dog will naturally have their mouth start watering in response to the food. So that's an unconditioned stimulus that gives us an unconditioned response. And you pair that with a neutral stimulus. So this neutral stimulus, the dog would not normally react to in the same way that it reacts to food. So like a whistle or a bell, a dog wouldn't normally have their mouth start watering to it. But if you expose the dog often enough to both of those two things together, then you get what we call a conditioned response to the conditioned stimulus, where the dog will start responding to the bell as it would to the food. So I do a very similar experiment, but to rats. So what I do is I give the rats a treat and I play a tone before I give them the treat and try to get them to associate the tone and the treat. My research also focuses on female brains, and that's something really important to talk about because a lot of research only uses male subjects. So why would I focus on female brains? First of all, they're cool. Secondly, like I said, they are historically understudied. Most research, especially in neuroscience, is done using only male subjects. And some diseases affect women differently from men. For example, anxiety and depression affect women at higher rates than men, and they can also present differently in women than men. In the type of research that I do, it's been shown also that female rats will respond differently than male rats. So that's important because whenever we're looking at different behaviors, you might get different behaviors out of the females than the males. And if we're looking at drugs, the females might respond differently to a drug. Therapeutic treatment, same thing. So it's really important that we're studying females and males. There's also this bias and this stigma against studying female brains in the field. So that's why I think it's something that's important to talk about to show that it can be done and it should be done. And lastly, I'm a woman with anxiety and depression, and so I want to learn more about my own brain. Well, say you've gotten to this point of the presentation and you're like, Morgan, that's super boring. I don't want to know any of this. I don't care about any of it. Is there anything else that you guys do? Yes, so this is a list just off the top of my head of the different topics that neuroscientists can study. So if you're not particularly interested in what I've had to say so far, there are so many other fields of neuroscience and so many other like different categories that you could study. Basically, if it has anything at all to do with the brain, a neuroscientist could study it. Okay, so now you're back on board, right? Like we want to become neuroscientists. Everyone wants to be a neuroscientist. How do I do it? So I'm going to talk a little bit about how to become a neuroscientist and about my own journey. So the first thing, you gotta finish high school. You need to get that high school diploma, that GED, whatever. But is there anything you could be doing to prepare to be a neuroscientist if that's what you really want to do? Or really to be a researcher in general? This is all good advice to anyone wanting to become a biological researcher. So something that you can do in high school is you can join a summer research program. So that's something that I did. That's where I got my very first lab experience, and it's a really nice introduction to neuroscience or whatever field you want to study. So basically all that you need to do, go to Google, search whatever the nearest university is to you, and then summer high school research program, or even just high school research program, and there will likely be some high school research options. Even if you can't go to like a specific research lab, sometimes there are like research boot camps where they just talk to you about how to do research. There's also different like STEM boot camps where you just like learn a little bit more about science. Any program like that is going to be really good for you. Next, we got to go to college and get our bachelor's degree. So I personally went to Oklahoma State University, but anywhere that'll give you a bachelor's degree is fine. Something that's really important to say is that it doesn't matter what you get your degree in. So a lot of people think if you want to become a neuroscientist, you have to get a degree in neuroscience. But my bachelor's degree is actually just in biology. I've seen people with engineering degrees, chemistry degrees, science degrees, psychology degrees. You should major in whatever interests you. The important thing is that you're taking science courses. And then you need to volunteer in a lab. So I have a video on my YouTube channel talking about how to get into a lab, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that. But basically, researchers love to talk about our research. Just go to your favorite professor and say, hey, are you looking for anyone in your lab? I'd love to talk to you about your research. Let them ramble on about their research for a good like 30 minutes and then be like, hey, do you need any volunteers? And they'll probably say yes. You're gonna want to make good grades. Notice I didn't say perfect grades though. No one is perfect. It's okay to not have a 4.0. Just try to keep it pretty good. And get involved with some science clubs. So colleges have tons of different clubs that you can join. Make sure at least one of those is sort of scientific. All right, and these next two steps can be done sort of at the same time, and that's taking some time to build up your resume and also applying to graduate schools. So some people decide to take a gap year on their own. Some people end up taking a gap year because they didn't get into grad school. The second one is what happened to me, and that's totally fine. Not everyone gets into grad school on the first try. But what's important is that while you're taking that extra year or how many extra years you want to take, you're still doing stuff to build up your resume. So one really great way to do that I've talked about a bunch is becoming a lab tech. And that's just someone who works in a lab full time. So these are some photos from whenever I was a lab tech. So some things to think about while you're also applying to graduate schools. You're gonna need a pretty decent GPA, so that's why I said keep your grades up in undergrad. And you're gonna need a good score on the GRE. So the GRE is very similar to the ACT, just at like a slightly higher level. You're gonna need letters of recommendations from professors and your research advisors, so make sure to develop some good relationships with at least 3 different professors. And you're gonna wanna have a detailed description of your previous research. The main questions that you're going to be asked when you're interviewing for graduate schools are going to be about your research. So you're gonna wanna know it pretty in depth. And then lastly, you're gonna go to grad school. So that's the step that I'm in right now. These are some pictures of me in the lab. The length of your graduate school depends on your field and also what you're trying to do with it. If you wanna get a master's degree, that's typically 1 or 2 years. And that will really get your foot in the door for most industry positions. And you can work in labs full-time with a master's. And then you can also do your PhD. So depending also on what country you're in, most countries, I believe outside of the US, require that you do a master's and then you do your PhD. In the US, you can go straight from undergrad to a PhD, or you could do your undergrad, master's, and then a PhD. And the average time that it takes for a PhD is anywhere from like 4 to 7 years. In neuroscience, it's usually around 5 years. During that time, you're gonna work in a lab full-time. And you're also going to take advanced classes like I was talking about earlier. And lastly, you're going to gain some teaching experience. Some people TA during grad school, some people give guest lectures. It really depends on sort of like who your advisor is and what classes you're involved in. So after grad school, you kind of have to make this decision between academia and industry. It is possible to switch back and forth, but you have to decide which one you're going to go into first. So whenever researchers talk about academia, basically what that means is that you're working for a university or a museum or some sort of educational facility. Most people in academia do teach both undergraduate and graduate classes. And sometimes they also like work in administration at universities. And whenever we talk about industry, that's basically anything other than a university. So that can be jobs like big pharma. You can work for a tech startup. You can make research equipment and medical equipment, producing different medicines. You could be a consultant for companies. A lot of marketing firms hire neuroscientists. There's really a lot of different jobs out there. So some last important things to mention that I couldn't really figure out where they fit in this presentation. First of all, everyone wants to know, how much do you get paid? Keep in mind this varies depending on where you're at, but this is around the averages for the US. And then how often do you work? What's the work-life balance like? That can really depend and it varies wildly. But on average, I would say that a scientist usually works anywhere from 40 to 60 hours a week. I have heard some people who work 80 hours a week, but I would say on average is probably somewhere around 50. And then lastly, something that is always important to me whenever I'm considering a job is how many coworkers you have. And the really nice thing about research is that this can vary depending on like your comfort level and what you want to do. There are some researchers who basically work in a closet all day and they never talk to anyone, and there are other researchers who work in giant labs of like 20 people, and there's all the way in between. So that's the end of my talk. Thanks for listening to it. I just included these photos at the end to show that not all scientists are robots. We do have fun sometimes. So this is my lab out having fun doing different things. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time I feel like posting. Bye.